My name's Rebecca Reynolds and I'm the Executive Director of the National LGBTI Health Alliance. And I'm joined today by my colleague Sally Morris, who coordinates our National Mind Out Suicide Prevention program. And we will be walking through with you today an introduction to LGBTI people and communities. And we hope that it's really useful for your work. We've got people attending from almost every state and territory, which is fantastic, and we're expecting a few more to join us as we move forward and go through the webinar today. So thank you to everyone. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting across Australia and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I'd also like to honour the LGBTI elders who have gone before us in this country, who have enabled this kind of opportunity and experience to actually happen today. So thank you very much for joining us. And this is one of a series of webinars that we'll be running, and we'll go through that in a minute. But first, for those of you who don't know the National LGBTI Health Alliance, we're the peak national health organisation in Australia for organisations and individuals who provide health-related programs and services, and sometimes research as well, focused on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex people and other sexuality, gender and bodily diverse people and communities. Our members are everything from small unfunded peer support groups to AIDS councils, to organisations like Beyond Blue, and then a number of therapeutic professionals working around the country in the area of providing support to members of our communities. The Alliance has a number of different project areas and work areas, but just to give you a highlight and some information about where you can go for further assistance. Mind Out Project works with mental health and suicide prevention and mainstream organisations, government organisations, and that's about working through and making processes, practices and employment workplaces accessible and inclusive, and removing barriers for people who might be wanting to access services that are delivered at a community level. QLife is a 365-day-a-year national phone and web-based counselling service, and that operates from 3 p.m. to midnight in every state and territory. And Silver Rainbow is our ageing and aged care training project that works with ageing and aged care providers across the country to make their services accessible and for them to understand some of the things that people who are ageing within our population might need specifically because of their sexuality, gender history or body. What we will be doing over the series of the webinars over the coming 6 to 8 weeks is providing a series of webinars for you that go into the intersections of people's lives who identify as LGBT or I or fit under that umbrella. And in addition to that, each week there'll be released a fact sheet which provides more direct information, and running through all of those will be information around data collection and language. And if you go to the PHN area, the registered area of our website, you'll see that the first fact sheet is up there, which is around language and around stuff that we'll be covering off today. We'll go through these dates again at the end of the webinar, but as you can see, over the next 6 weeks, we have a number of different topic areas and interest areas. We will be running those webinars through our team at the Alliance in their areas of specialisation, but also we'll be bringing in some experts to help assist and support and to really be able to answer the questions that you might have in those different topic areas as we go forward. But why it is important and why we were given the funding to run this series of webinars with you is can probably be best summed up in the next 2 slides before I hand over to Sally. And that's that most of the research that we know tells us that a large number of people do not disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity to a large number of different forums and areas and services, and including family, school, home, but that 22% occasionally don't tell services about their sexuality or their gender identity, and 12% usually don't tell services as a matter of practice about their sexuality or their gender identity. And that we know that this is because that they feel like there are invisible barriers often in place that mean that they don't feel comfortable to be able to have those conversations with professionals. And so our hope today in working through this webinar and through this series of webinars is giving you the skills and the tools and the tips to be able to make your service accessible so that LGBTI people know that they can come and seek the support that they need from you in your local area and with the skills that you have. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sally and let her get into the content of the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're really going to be touching on the introduction to LGBTI people and communities. And I'm going to take you through a little bit about who are LGBTI people, their lived experiences, and why is that important to professionals in the sector. So I know we're talking about an acronym, and later on through today's webinar, we will unpack this acronym. But when we use the acronym LGBTI, we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex people. And we will unpack those more specifically later. But when we're talking about LGBTI people and communities, it's really important to remember that we're talking about a diverse range of real people living real lives, and LGBTI people are in every other aspect within our communities. And so we come from every other space in the community. So this slide here really shows those intersections that LGBTI people come from all different cultures, have all different faiths and religions, have different roles in their families, come from regional areas, metropolitan areas, might have disabilities, are different ages, might have different health experiences. And so because of that, LGBTI people are present in every other community group that you'll be already working with, which is one of the reasons why it's important to be aware of LGBTI people's needs and health experiences and health outcomes. Why? I guess it's often when we talk about LGBTI people, we like to talk about, well, why is this important for you to be aware of LGBTI people and communities? What we do know is that LGBTI people have a diverse range of health and wellbeing outcomes. And I will take you through some of these, and over the following weeks, the other webinars will take you through some other these intersections as well. But we do know that LGBTI people have poorer mental health outcomes. There's some experiences with their physical health that is poorer. They have high rates of drug and alcohol use. There's some aspects to their sexual health that need specific support, and they have high risk of some specific things within sexual health. There's particular vulnerabilities there around intimate partner and family violence. There's high rates of homelessness, and there's also high rates of suicide ideation and suicide attempts. So I'm going to take you through some of the mental health statistics just to give that sense of baseline about the experience of LGBTI people. So what we have here is a graph that shows the rate of mental health diagnosis, and this includes depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders in the previous 12 months to 3 years. On the left-hand side, we have the general population, that sits around 20% of the general population has a mental health diagnosis over the last 12 months to 3 years. And as we go across the graph, we can see that within the LGBTI community and populations that there's varying levels of risk. So we can see that gay men have higher rates and lesbian women have higher rates, and so forth as we go along to bisexual men, bisexual women, trans men and trans women. We don't have any statistics around the mental health diagnosis for intersex people here, but across the board we can see that LGBT people have high rates of mental health diagnosis, and within our LGBTI community there are varying rates as well, which is really important for us to be mindful of. And again here with the using the K10 score, which looks at psychological distress, we can see that the average, the general population is considered to have a low level of psychological stress at a score of 14.5. But as we move across the LGBT acronym here, we can see that some people within this space fall into the moderate level, and also some people in our trans space fall into the high level of psychological distress. So again, we know that LGBT people have higher levels of psychological distress when compared to the general population. And again, here looking at suicide ideation. So this is about thoughts of suicide and self-harm in the last 2 weeks to 12 months. And we know in the general population, about 2.3% of the general population have thoughts of suicide. And again, as we move across the table here to look at different aspects of our LGBTI population, we see that there's much higher rates of suicide ideation across the board. And also within the acronym, there's certain identities and experiences that have a significantly higher rate of suicide ideation. And down the end, we can see that people with intersex variations have a 60% risk of suicide ideation over the last 2 weeks or 12 months. So significantly higher than the general population. And again, we know this for suicide attempts over a person's lifetime. So about 3.2% of the general population will attempt suicide over their lifetime. And again, as we move across the table here, we can see that LGBTI people have a much higher rate of suicide attempts in a lifetime when compared to the general population. So I think it was really important for us to sort of start at this space to communicate about, well, why is it important that we are talking about LGBTI people and communities? Why is it important to your work, and why is this relevant to you? Where we're going to move to a little bit next is around, well, why is this experience happening? And that starts to allow you to think about, well, what can I start to do in my practice to better support LGBTI people? We know within our history, in our community history, LGBTI people have often been subject to oppression and prejudice, persecution, in lots of different ways. We know that homosexuality was deemed to be a mental illness. It has been a crime. In some parts of our community, it's still very much seen as a sin and immoral and social taboo. And even though this is history, some of this is really recent history, and some of this actually isn't history, but current daily lived experience of being an LGBTI person in our community. So what we're really talking about here is social and cultural norms. In the world around us, we receive lots of messages from lots of different places about who we should be and how we should be that type of person. And these messages influence how we think and feel about ourselves and how we choose to interact with the world. So we receive these messages from our families, our communities, role models, from our schools, from our faith and religions, from advertising, social norms, and from our organisations as well. And they subtly tell us that this is what we're supposed to be like. And for many LGBTI people, who they are doesn't quite fit with these general social and cultural norms. So there's a sense of not quite fitting in with these expectations about who I am and who I'm supposed to be doesn't quite fit with who people think I should be. One thing that's really related to this is this concept of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is a really important concept to be aware of. And essentially, it's the assumption that everyone we engage with is heterosexual and that their gender is what they were assigned at birth. And usually heteronormativity doesn't come with any ill intent or malice, but the impact is that heterosexuality is seen as the norm, and therefore that there's a subtle message that that's better and superior. And consequently, LGBTI people can feel very invisible, excluded, isolated, and it can make it very difficult for people to disclose and say, this is who I am, when you're encountered with the assumption that this is who you should be. And this happens with friends and family, but also this happens substantially within organisations as well. Through our intake and assessments, there's an assumption that people are heterosexual and that the gender that they are now was the gender that they were born as and assigned as birth as well. This is, I guess, heteronormativity is really related, I guess, to myths and stereotypes, but myths and stereotypes also still form a really big part of the experiences of being LGBTI. And stereotypes generally are those really simplified overgeneralizations, not to say that they aren't true about our experience, but they're only one part of the story, and they really give just one side of a much more complex, nuanced individual. And so stereotypes can be useful sometimes, but also can be unuseful when it limits our ability to see someone as a much more broader, diverse person. And related stereotypes are myths, and myths around LGBTI people and communities have persisted, and they still continue to persist for a really, really long time. And usually these are quite unproven or false beliefs, but these beliefs are usually used to justify a particular value. These values generally being that LGBTI people aren't as worthy or as important as people who aren't LGBTI. And myths and stereotypes really can result in very little recognition and positive recognition of LGBTI people in the world around us. And we still see lots of myths and stereotypes in our media, in the TV shows, in advertising, and often myths and stereotypes can influence how service providers identify an LGBTI person and how we interact with LGBTI people. Again, really related to myths and stereotypes. Often myths and stereotypes feed stigma and prejudice. Stigma is the negative reaction to being perceived as LGBTI or in reaction to perceiving someone else as being LGBTI. It's quite an internal feeling that people will have that's, again, influenced by these social messages that we're receiving in the world around us about who we should be and who other people should be. Related to stigma is prejudice. It's about when is more than a negative reaction. It's actually an opinion or a negative attitude about a group of people, which is usually based upon those misinformations of myths and stereotypes. From stigma and prejudice, we move on to discrimination. Really, discrimination is stigma and prejudice in action. So it moves beyond a thought and a feeling to an act. And LGBTI people are still, to this day, subject to a range of experiences of discrimination. We see discrimination for LGBTI people happening between individuals, so it can happen between peers, it can happen between groups of people. It can also happen, though, within organisations, where organisations might have policies or procedures or structures that will discriminate against LGBTI people. We also see systems and certainly legislation that discriminate against LGBTI people. So it does happen at multiple layers. And because it happens at multiple layers, those layers interact with each other and influence each other as well. So when we have systems that discriminate against LGBTI people, it sometimes gives that sense of permission that it's okay for individuals to discriminate against LGBTI people. And this discrimination can look in lots of different ways. It can look at the verbal threats, but also can be physical violence, sexual assaults, unsafe environments, vilification, which is sort of the encouraging of other people to act violently against LGBTI people. And what we do know is that there is a really strong relationship between negative rhetoric about LGBTI people, so negative verbal rhetoric, and acts of violence against LGBTI people. We've seen this in other countries when there's this relationship between what we say and then the actions that people act against LGBTI people. I guess another really concept that's really important to be quite aware of, and it's related to these things, stigma and prejudice and discrimination, and to these poorer mental health outcomes, is this concept of minority stress. LGBTI people, along with other minority groups, experience minority stress. But essentially, minority stress is that daily low-level stress in your life that starts to impact on your mental health and well-being. This daily stress are these actual experiences of stigma and prejudice that we encounter in the world around us, but also the expectation that you might experience stigma and prejudice when you go out into your community or go and access a service. So you might not have actual experience of stigma, but the thought that you might is enough to impact on people's well-being. People then begin to internalize those negative messages. So it's not only becomes that that person has a poor value and is discriminated against me, but it's about, well, there's something wrong with me and it's my fault that I am experiencing these experiences. So the internalization of those negative messages about something's wrong with me. And then additionally, the last part of the minority stress is that LGBTI people will begin to adapt behaviour, blend in as a way to prevent these negative experiences. So if I adapt my behaviour and if I can pass as being heterosexual, or if I can pass at being male or female, then I won't be targeted. But what we do also know is that when people aren't able to be authentic and be genuine about who they are, again, this has a negative impact on health and well-being. So minority stress is a really important concept to be aware of, and has a significant impact on the health and wellbeing outcomes of LGBTI people. Again, I guess sort of to wrap up this little section here, it's probably really helpful for people to be aware that in Australia we do have protections for LGBTI people under the Sex Discrimination Act. This was amended in 2013 to make it unlawful to discriminate against a person on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status under federal law. And this was the first time that all aspects of the LGBTI community were included in legislation. However, it's also really important for service providers to be aware, and for LGBTI individuals to be aware. There are certain exemptions that allow discrimination to be considered lawful. And these, one probably very contentious conversation at the moment is around marriage equality. So in the Sex Discrimination Act, there's a clause that says the Marriage Act is allowed to discriminate against LGBTI people. Another one people may not be as aware of, but is probably really important, is that from our religious-based organisations can lawfully discriminate against providing services to LGBT people under the Sex Discrimination Act. There is an exemption to that exemption where aged care providers delivering federally funded aged care services aren't allowed to discriminate against LGBTI people in aged care services. So I think it's important to be aware of what protections are available for LGBTI communities, but also be aware of what exemptions are there and whether actually LGBTI people are aware of protections that are there to support them, and whether they're actually able to access the systems and support to make complaints when they have negative experiences, and that many LGBTI people may not have the capacity or resilience to follow up on actual complaints. So I'm going to be moving a little bit more now into unpacking this concept of what is LGBTI. As I start to move into this section, I'd like to sort of invite people, if you have any questions, we have a little text box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So if you have any questions about any of the concepts that we've been talking about that you might want further clarification on, please just type a little message there, and as we go out through this last section, I'll touch on any of those queries. And at the end of this presentation, we should have time to go through some of those questions for you in more depth. So please feel to ask questions throughout, and also the resources we have available on the PHN site and on the Alliance website will also help answer some of those questions. So I've been using this acronym LGBTI, and I really wanted to take you a little bit through why we're talking about LGBTI. Now I really want to take you through this, well, what is LGBTI? As I mentioned earlier, there's these 5 different letters that are together in this single acronym, but actually what we're talking about is people with around sexualities, around genders and bodies. So in our acronym here, the lesbian, gay, bisexual refers to people's sexualities, trans and transgender refers to people's genders, and intersex refers to people's bodies. And I'm going to go through these a little bit more in depth so people can understand the diversity within this LGBTI community. So just, I guess, again, just to really put this together, we are talking about 3 different aspects, but these 3 different aspects also do overlap. and interrelate to each other. So you might have a transgender person who is also gay and lesbian. You might have a person with intersex characteristics who might also identify as transgender and who might also identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual. So even though these are quite separate concepts, they do interrelate and overlap with each other as well, which is one of the reasons why our community is put together as the LGBTI community, because even though these are very different experiences, they are related and interrelate with each other. Again, when we're in the LGBTI community, we are really mindful that our language and terminology is really important, but also really important that to know and to be aware of that our language and terminology is changing over time, and in one sense can be changing quite rapidly. So the fact sheet we have available for you today is on inclusive language. And for many people, that can be a space where they feel really uncomfortable and uncertain about, am I using the right language? What do these words mean? When can I use them? When shouldn't I use them? So as an organisation, we hope to really provide you a guidance about what's happening in language in the LGBTI community currently, but also it's really important to be aware that language is evolving and it will continue to change. So sometimes the words we might even be using today might be shifting and changing, and we might not use them in the future. Certainly there's words we used only in the recent past that we actually tend not to use so much now. So it's important to be aware of the changing nature of language, but also aware of why. Is that what we know is that there's newer communities emerging. People are finding that the existing terms don't quite fit their experiences, and as we gain greater awareness about how language is related to experience of stigma and exclusion. So as we become more aware of the impact of language, we tailor and move our language to be more inclusive. So I'm going to sort of take you through some of the language we're currently using, but really want you to be mindful that this is a constantly evolving space, and that's okay. But also, we also know when we're talking about LGBTI, it can be quite limiting to talk about these 5 single identities within this acronym. So when the National LGBTI Health Alliance, when we use LGBTI, we intend to use it in the broadest way possible with the intention of supporting as many populations, communities within that space as possible. So we're not only talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people, we're also talking about the full breadth of people's bodies, genders, relationships, histories, lived experience that might be within this space of this concept of LGBTI. So I think, again, that's really important there'll be other words that people use beyond LGBTI. There'll be other frameworks, sometimes in different locations in different states. There will be slightly different variances of the acronym. And that's okay, but certainly at a national level we use LGBTI, but at the same time aim to talk about as many people in this space as possible. So I'm going to take you through this acronym, and I really always like to start at the end of our acronym and move our way forward. Mostly this is because people have the least amount of knowledge about the end part of our acronym. So this is the I, the intersex in our acronym. And when we're talking about intersex, we're actually talking about our bodies, the sex of our bodies. So when we're born, what our bodies look like. And our bodies are usually classified as male or female bodies based on our genitals. However, as I like to say, Mother Nature is actually not that dull, and she likes diversity. And there's a huge number of people in our community whose bodies can't nicely fit into those categories of male or female. And this is based upon anatomy, genitals, their hormones and chromosomes. And the word intersex is the word that we use to describe peoples whose bodies don't quite nicely fit into those classifications of male or female. I guess regardless of what people's bodies look like and how they are made up, it is still really important to know, or not to know, but to be aware of what sex was given to that person at birth. So what sex was recorded on their birth certificate when they were born. So was that person classified as a male person? Were they classified as a female person? Some people sometimes even won't have a sex record on their birth certificate at all, or might have the term intersex recorded there, or another term. And why that is important is because our society is a very gendered space where, depending on your gender, you may or may not be able to access certain spaces. So, for example, education institutions might be designated across male or female. Sporting groups might be across male or female. Even in our industry, we have services who are there to provide services to women or to men. So depending on what is assigned on your birth certificate will impact what services and support you're able to access in the future. So here's a definition of intersex that is helpful for when you're trying to talk about, well, what is this word intersex, and how do I communicate about this? So, and as you can see here in the language we often use, we tend not to talk about intersex people. We tend to talk about people with intersex characteristics, and very much that people first language. Intersex isn't an identity in the same way that lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender is an identity. Rather, it is an experience that someone has. So a person born with intersex characteristics, they're born with characteristics that differ from these concepts that we understand as male or female. Intersex is not around gender, but is around physical bodies. Many people with intersex characteristics will often describe themselves simply as men or women. Some might describe themselves as another gender. Some may identify as transgender, but many do not. So it's really important that we don't confuse intersex with transgender, which is going to be where we move into next. So again, intersex is really about bodies and variations in people's physical bodies, not about gender. So as we move back through the acronym, so that was talking about I, the I for intersex in our acronym. As we move back to the T for trans or transgender, what we're really talking about here is gender. So gender is the social construct of man and woman. So these are your personal and social identities as man or woman. And again, our society often prescribes to us a very black and white binary way of seeing gender, that we have men and women. However, what we are seeing in our community, in the LGBTI community and broader community, is that there is a vast number of people who are exploring and experiencing their gender beyond that binary of men and women, and that there's a lot of space between that. There's people who might identify as not having a gender. So on the screen here, you can see there's other terms that people are using to describe their gender beyond man or woman. So we're seeing terms such as gender neutral, agender, gender queer as well, are other terms that people describe their gender when they don't necessarily feel that their identity fits purely in that binary black and white space of male or female. And this is also the space where we have transgender people who their gender identity is different to their body that they were born with. So you might have someone who at birth would be we would call a man or male, but they identify their gender as a woman. So that we would that's where the term trans comes in, to refer to people whose gender identity shifts from one gender to another. Not all trans people will identify as trans, so not all. So some trans women will purely identify simply as a woman, and some trans men will identify simply as a man. However, there'll be other people whose the concept of trans as an identity is a really important part of who they are as well. When we use the word trans man, we're talking about someone whose gender is currently as a man, so who has moved from the gender of female to the gender of male. And when we talk about trans women, we're talking about people whose gender is currently a woman, and they've moved from a space from a gender of a male to a gender of a woman. I identify that this can be quite a confusing space for people, and certainly in the trans and intersex spaces, for many people, is a space where they feel they need to learn a lot more, and we really encourage people to spend time exploring this, learning, reading things around gender and around bodies, and that can be really important to help in your own professional development as you go along in your work. Another concept that's really important when we talk about gender is pronouns. So pronouns in our language are words that take place of a person's name when you're not using that person's name. So generally we might refer to a female person as she, her, or hers, and we refer to a male person as he, him, and his. And again, as I guess you can appreciate, as people are exploring their gender, more broadly than these concepts of male and female pronouns can become problematic. And so there's a range of people who utilise gender neutral pronouns such as they, theirs and them. And people might actually create or utilise other pronouns that might not be as common to our language as well. And additionally, people might simply use their name instead of a pronoun. In our language, it's very structured, I guess. We have very gendered language, and for many of us, it become quite difficult to learn how to use different pronouns. And one of the first things we do when we meet someone often is assess what gender they are, and therefore assign them what pronoun we should use. And it's quite an automatic thought process. What I like to encourage people to do is to practice using different pronouns, and to practice unpacking the structured way that we think about pronouns. When we're talking about pronouns, and we're talking about trans and gender diverse people, it is really important that we don't use words to describe objects, to describe people. So we don't refer to transgender people as it or that or thing. These are words we use for inanimate objects, not for people. So it is really important to practice with pronouns, and a really important concept when we're talking about gender. Here's a definition of trans and transgender. So these often are umbrella terms used to describe people whose gender is different to the sex that they were assigned at birth. And that gender can be in how they identify their gender, how they express their gender, and how they behave in that gender role in our community. It's in also, when we're talking about gender, other cultures will have different words and concepts to understand and explain and talk about gender. And in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia, there's other concepts around gender. So in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, they will talk about sister girls and brother boys, which is their own cultural understanding of gender that's different to our understanding of gender. And people from different cultures and countries will also have other diverse ways of understanding gender that's outside of our very binary man-woman way of seeing and understanding gender. As we move back through this acronym, so we've talked about the I for intersex and the T for trans. Now we're really looking at the LGB part of our acronym. And when we're looking at this front part of our acronym, what we're really talking about here is sexuality, is people's physical, romantic and emotional attraction to other people. And whether this attraction is to people who are of the same gender, or whether this attraction is to people of a different gender. And as we as a community and as a broader community are unpacking gender to be more diverse than male and female, you can appreciate the concept of sexuality is also becoming more diverse as well. And that the words people use to describe their sexuality are also evolving and changing and emerging over time. So even though in our acronym we focus on the identities of lesbian, gay and bisexual, there's also a range of other identities people will use to describe their sexuality, such as the word queer. Pansexual is also a terminology that people will use. Pansexual is emerging as a term in response to bisexual, bi meaning two, and I guess as people are appreciating that there's more than two genders, they're looking for other words to describe attraction to a broad, diverse range of genders, not just men and women. that someone might describe as having attraction to all genders. We're also seeing certainly in our younger population, but in our community also, are people who identify as not having any sexual attraction to anybody, and will use the term asexual to describe that experience of not having any sexual attraction to other people. However, there's also a really diverse range of other terminologies and words that people will use to describe their experiences, and their identities are much, much more broader than this LGBTI acronym as well. So just here is a couple of definitions for you to help with these words as lesbian and gay. So the word lesbian usually refers to a woman who experiences attraction to other women. However, other women may use other language to describe their attraction, including the word gay. In our acronym, gay usually refers to gay men who are men who primarily have attraction to other men. Again, men might have other ways of describing their identity and their attraction. And again, women might utilise the word gay to also describe their sexuality and attraction. The word bisexual could relate to a person of any gender who has attraction to people from more than one gender. And as I was describing before, certainly as people identifying that there's more than two genders, we're seeing other words emerge, such as queer and pansexual. But generally, people who experience attraction to more than a single gender will utilise the label bisexual or identify themselves within that part of our acronym to refer to themselves. So we're sort of coming to a little bit to the end of the formal content for today. So I'd really encourage anyone out there, if you have any questions about some of the content that we're providing, please just type a question and we're able to respond to that. When we're also talking about LGBTI, I've been talking a lot about identity, and that certainly lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans are identities, but I also identified that intersex is not an identity. But when we're talking about LGBT as an identity, what we do know is the identities that someone holds and refers to themselves may or may not actually be the same as the behaviour that they engage with in the community, nor might not be the same as their internal thoughts and feelings. So often it's not as simple as identifying who are LGBTI people based on what words we use to describe ourselves. We know that certainly that there's a huge range of peoples who will never identify with those terms, but would still be considered a part of our community based on their behaviour and feelings. And that's a really important concept, I think, for yourself as service providers to be aware of, that it's important to not only focus on identity, but feelings, behaviour is also really important. Also, when we're talking about identity, it's also really important to be aware that identity is something that we only can choose for ourselves. And this can be quite important. Sometimes I've certainly had experiences over the years where I've had people come to me and they've described their feelings and behaviour, and they've often been seeking an identity and go, well, what am I? If I've done this and I've done this and I feel like this, what identity best suits me? And to sometimes give people that space to allow them to explore their own identity and create their own words, and there doesn't necessarily need to be a match between feelings, behaviour and identity for that those experiences, regardless, are valid and meaningful for that person. And generally what we do know, though, when feelings, behaviour and identity align, people's well-being is generally better, because people who feel they need to hide their identity and hide their behaviour and hide their feelings, that impacts on their well-being. So when they're engaging with families and friends and communities and service providers, this is sense of I'm not able to be authentic, or I'm not able to tell you who I am, and that's another aspect that can really impact on health and well-being. So often one of the questions we will often get asked is how many LGBTI people are there? Unfortunately, this isn't a really simple question to answer, but is related to the last slide around feelings, behaviour, identity. So first of all, questions around LGBTI identity or sexuality or gender or intersex status aren't usually routinely recorded with any general population data statistics. So we don't have any sort of standardised data to allow us to tell us how many LGBTI people there are. However, from what we do, from research who has asked this question, we do know there's differences between when we ask questions about, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual? We get around 4% of the population say, yes, I identify as lesbian, gay or bisexual. But when we also know that when we ask questions around, have you engaged in same gender sexual behaviour or do you experience same gender attraction, we get a significantly higher number of people identifying with that experience. So about 9% of men and 15% of women identifying as having same gender attraction or have engaged in same gender sexual behaviour. So there's a difference there between identity and behaviour. We also know this to be true around gender, about transgender people. So about 0.6% of the population identifies transgender, but we also know that also about 2% of the population have feelings, strong feelings of being transgender. So again, there's that difference between people who identify with particular labels and then those who might identify with an experience that's related to being LGBTI. Intersex, because intersex is a biological variance, is quite consistent across populations. There is a vast number of different intersex variations. I think there's about 30 different types of intersex variations. Some are more common than others, depending on the variation, but it is quite consistent. Around the 1.7% of our population have intersex variations across any country or culture or space. Again, reminding you that people with intersex variations might not identify as intersex. They might, but many do not. Many might just simply identify as a man or a woman, but also might be a part of people who identify as transgender and also might be a part of people who identify as lesbian and gay, bisexual. So there's an overlap between these three different concepts in our community. Okay, so that sort of wraps up the core part of our presentation today. I'm going to hand back over to Rebecca Reynolds and really encourage you, if you have any questions there, please type us a question. So thank you, Beck.
Thank you, Sally. There has been a question or two, and I think they came up when you were talking in two areas. One around brother boys and sister girls, and Indigenous identity around sexuality and gender. And it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed learning since I've been at the Alliance and working with different Indigenous organisations across the country, is that people of different sexualities and different gender identities have been present throughout Indigenous history and culture on this land. And as we have changed that system and that culture and given new language to words around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex, they too have had to find words to fit in with our systems to let their bodies and their histories and their sexualities be understood. So it has been a journey upon a journey for them, and continues to be a journey that has many different avenues and facets. But there are many Indigenous-led organisations around this country working in this area, and we can connect you into them and some in your local area if that's of use to you. And I think the second area of clarification came around why do people tend to get confused with T and I, with trans and intersex. And I think Sal spoke to this a little bit, that when a child is born with an intersex characteristic, more often than not, and still today, the parents are asked to make a decision at that point in time to assign a gender to their child. And then that child may need to undergo years of surgery or ongoing hormone treatment, or many other facets of medicalised treatment pathways to maintain that gender that has been chosen for them at birth. When a number of children who have been through this process reach adolescence or hit puberty, sometimes their body says, no, I'm actually going to start acting in a particular way now that is different to how my gender is being expressed to the world. And so then sometimes intersex people will go through a gender transition based on the fact that their body has started developing in a different way. So while it's a really complex issue, and as Sal said, I would encourage you to read the really great information that's out there, and we're going to make sure that there's lots of information up on the PHN website this afternoon for you as well. That's a sort of a simple way of looking at what happens there. And I think for health professionals, what we always try and say is that it's really important to ask those questions around behaviours rather than assuming that the person you're looking at is going to have a particular set of healthcare needs based on what you think that might be within their body and what you can't see. So it's really good to be able to educate yourself on asking questions around what behaviours that people are practicing rather than assuming from what's in front of you. I think that's it in terms of questions. But thank you all for joining us and for your time today. It's really appreciated. As you know, our next webinar will be next Wednesday, and that will be specifically on LGBTI older people and ageing. Please feel free to share this through your networks, through PHN networks, and with any colleagues that you think might find it interesting or workers working in the area. And we look forward to working with you into the future. We have a staff member who specifically can help with your work if you have specific questions or need specific referrals, and you can reach them at the email address or phone number on the screen now. And thank you for your time, and thanks for the comments that I can see coming through as well. We're glad that you appreciated it, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.